This is Natasha Helfer, and I wanted to just give you a few updates that are happening at Symmetry Counseling and in my practice in the coming months. I will be holding my first Ketamine group session on January 25th from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. in our Holiday, Utah office, with the theme being Reclaiming Female Sexuality. There's 15 spots available, so I know that they'll go quickly, so make sure you call to register. We are super excited to be using ketamine at Symmetry. It's an extremely helpful medicine in helping people with stuck thinking patterns. So this is where so many people benefit from, either past trauma or past education, past sex negative messaging, lots of things that you can feel stuck on and you want to kind of redirect and re-explore your body, your preferences, your identity, your joy, your pleasure, right? And we want to get old thinking unstuck. So super excited to be offering this. It will be kind of a uniquely guided experience. I'm going to curate for you to feel safe and to be able to explore a lot of these themes that we're going to be talking about. If you are a current client of mine or past client of mine, I'm offering an additional 10% off the early bird or regular price, depending on when you sign up. You have until December 15th to still benefit from the early bird rate. Yeah, just call the office for information and you will be able to get registered for that. Other groups, I'm starting in January. So my pretty popular Navigating Ethical Non-Monogamy group is going to be starting on January 17th on Fridays from noon to 1:30 Mountain Time. You can join these anywhere in the world as long as it works with your time difference changes. And it will be 7 weeks long, and it is for either couples or individuals who are interested in potentially starting non-monogamy in their lives, or maybe have already been in the lifestyle but are wanting to either get better at certain aspects of it, learn how to deal with challenges in more effective ways. I will also be doing a Healing from Male Sexual Shame group starting on January 30th. This will be on Thursdays from noon to 1:30, again, Mountain Time, again, online, so you can join me from anywhere. And this group is kind of for people who identify as male and either come from purity culture, sex negative thinking, and potentially also were treated under the sex addiction narrative and ways that has hurt them from considering themselves just on the spectrum of human diversity versus diseased or sick or something along those lines. So that's also a very popular group, and I encourage you to sign up for that if you haven't. I also have one of my providers, Sarah Rands. She's going to be offering a group on dating and kind of the typical challenges of dating as an adult. It's meant for any gender, any sexual orientation, and that will be a 6-week also online group. So if you're interested in that as well, call the office at Symmetry Counseling. And I also want to let people know that we have 2 current interns at our practice who are taking on new clients, as well as some of our more established providers. So we do have openings at Symmetry Counseling. I know sometimes people have a hard time finding a therapist with openings. And we work with all the general things as well, of course, the specific intersection and expertise on religion, mental health, and sexuality. So that's a little bit about us, and hope you're having a great day. Please consider subscribing to the YouTube channel or also offering a donation to keep this podcast alive. And thank you so much for listening.
Welcome to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional Facebook page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. You can also find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The information shared on this program is informational and should not be considered therapy. This podcast addresses many topics around mental health and sexuality and may not be suitable for minors. Some topics may elicit a trigger or emotional response, so please care for yourself accordingly. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed by our guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views or feelings of Natasha Helfer or the Natasha Helfer Podcast. We provide a platform for open and diverse discussions, and it is important to recognize that different perspectives may be shared. We encourage our listeners to engage in critical thinking and form their own opinions. The intro and outro music for these episodes is by Otter Creek. Thank you for listening.
Welcome, everyone, to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. Today, I am really excited to have Dr. Camden Morganti. Did I say that right?
Morganti.
Morganti. She is the author of Recovering from Purity Culture. I'll read her bio. She's a licensed psychologist with nearly 15 years of experience as a therapist. She owns a private therapy practice and is a writer, speaker, and coach. Dr. Camden combines her personal experience growing up in purity culture with her professional experience in mind-body integration to help her clients and readers heal their faith from toxic beliefs. Dr. Camden lives in Knoxville, Tennessee with her husband and 2 kiddos, and you can learn more about her at drcamden.com, which we will make sure we put in the show notes. And here at this podcast, our whole theme is attacking shame wherever we can find it, especially in sexual realms. So this is right on point with, I think, what a lot of my audience is interested in chatting about. And so welcome to the show. We're so excited to have you this morning.
Thank you, Natasha. I appreciate the invitation and the chance to talk to your people.
Yeah. Well, but it's Valentine's Day. I love your earrings. Nothing more than doing something loving than listening to purity culture issues.
Right. Talking about sex and shame.
So hopefully we can have better love and sex and connections in our lives. So, so I guess I'd love to start by giving you a chance to introduce yourself further, tell a little bit more about your story from your own voice and let us get to know you a little bit better.
Okay, sure. Well, I grew up with an evangelical Christian background as a Protestant Christian, and purity culture was very much a part of my upbringing. I'm a millennial woman, and I say that purity culture really peaked in the 90s to early 2000s, which is when many of my generation were teenagers or young adults and kind of in that pivotal stage of learning about sex and our sexual development and our faith development too. And so purity culture was a part of my upbringing, and I very much bought into it and was a big proponent of it and, believed in it, adhered to it, preached it to others, tried to follow it myself. And it wasn't until I went through a period of rethinking my faith and my beliefs in my 20s and was going through graduate school to get my doctorate in psychology that I started to look at purity culture with more of a critical lens. And especially after I got married and was working with clients, I just was able to see it had good intentions for the most part, but it had some really unanticipated consequences that I'm seeing in myself and my clients and my friends now too. So that got me started on a journey of deconstructing it for myself and reading and researching about it, and then eventually writing this book and speaking about it on podcasts and trying to help people heal from the shame and the trauma of purity culture.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And I think since most of my audience probably comes from an LDS or Mormon background, we tend to use the term purity culture, but I'm not sure my audience is always completely educated on what that movement looked like outside of our community. Mm-hmm. and I think and it's interesting because there's a lot of things that happened in the evangelical kind of world that was not happening necessarily in Mormon land, right? So one of the things that you mentioned, for example, is the book I Kissed Dating Goodbye, and the author of that book that I think was very popular amongst your faith community, as well as things like abstinence pledge cards. You mentioned something like True Love Waits. I wasn't really sure what that meant either. I had to go look that up. So I wonder if you can just go through some of the highlights, or at least like cultural language that comes from your community on some of those things.
Sure. Yeah, I've talked to a lot of other LDS influencers, therapists, leaders, and it's very interesting to see the overlap and the similarities, but then also to note some of the differences. A lot of the myths are very similar, that I call them myths, from our faith traditions. But the culture that grew up around purity culture that kind of was brought up was very heavy in evangelical communities. So the book you mentioned, True Love Waits, was an organization sponsored by the Southern Baptist Convention, which is the largest evangelical denomination, where I signed a True Love Waits card that said, that created a pledge to wait until I was married to have sex. And sometimes there were rallies or even like chastity balls between a father and daughter, where you're pledging your father your virginity until you get married. Rings were very very popular. I had a True Love Waits ring. So some of those like books and conferences just based on this, and sermons just based on this this concept of purity culture were just very heavily emphasized, to the point where all of our kind of spiritual development became focused on just this narrow concept of purity, as in sexual abstinence.
Yeah, right. And I think especially you write a little bit later about the author, right, who wrote I Kissed Dating Goodbye, and he ended up I guess years later getting a divorce from his spouse, and I think also like not wanting to own what he had written in his book anymore. So he went around, I think you called it like an apologetic type of tour.
Apologies tour. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. He came out and said, he announced his divorce from his wife of 20 something years. And a lot of his, books that he wrote as a 20-year-old, he wrote them very young, were about, look how this has worked for me. Look how this model of courtship and purity has worked for me because I have, my wife now. And then he also deconverted from the faith, like came out publicly and said, I no longer identify as a Christian. That label no longer describes me. And his ex-wife at this point has as well. And so that's a very like disturbing experience, I guess, for us to see somebody who was like a father of the movement, even though he was only 20, so hardly a father, but just someone who was like a leader in our faith decades later to deconvert, and for him to denounce these principles. Like, it's uncomfortable, and it, I think, has led to a wave of other evangelicals leaving the faith, or at least distancing from that label, as I would now myself distance from the label of evangelical.
Yeah, right. Okay. And that we see that a lot with like authors too, of like conversion therapy amongst the LGBTQ community. There's like a lot of things that were happening in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s around sexuality and sexual education that really has not stood firm in the research and the evidence and the results for people. And so it's always difficult, I guess, when people have to face that cognitive dissonance, right? Between things that they've been taught to believe and actual ways life shows up. So you briefly mentioned kind of that you started studying the effects and noticing the effects, maybe even personally, of purity culture on yourself and your sexual pleasure and your relationships and other people's. Can you let's talk about some of those? Like what are some of the results that are actually tied to how we think about sexuality? Because I think sometimes we think, well, our bodies just work no matter what, but it seems like evidence has shown that actually what we believe about our bodies and sexuality actually impacts our sexuality.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the research, and then in my own work on this topic, I kind of categorize the effects into three categories: faith, sexuality, and relationships. So purity culture affected me the most in the faith category. It was really what contributed to my deconstruction and the wrestling of my faith in my 20s. This idea that, well, because I was pure, God owes me a spouse and a blessed marriage, and that didn't happen in the timing that I thought it was going to happen in, and that was very painful for me. And also a lot of, like you said, cognitive dissonance of just like, well, what's the whole point of this then if I'm not going to get this promised reward? So it led to a lot of faith struggles for me, and in my clients I see it leads to some religious trauma too, a trauma response in their body to these teachings or to specific religious practices or structures it can lead to. And then in the category of sexuality, that's where we have the most empirical research showing that believing in some of these beliefs or teachings or myths of purity culture can lead to later sexual problems. It shows up as sexual pain. It shows up as lower orgasm rates for women, lower desire, lower sexual satisfaction, greater sexual shame. Like, there's just a host of sexual problems, to the point that some experts and leaders in this topic have noticed that survivors of sexual abuse and people coming out of purity culture can look very similar in the ways that their bodies respond sexually later on. So some people consider purity culture a form of sexual abuse, or certainly a form of trauma for many people. And then the last category, relationships, we probably have like the least amount of empirical research on. So most of my statements are more anecdotal, or from, what I've seen in my practice or what I hear and as I speak about this. But just that people are set up for a lot of inequality in their relationships, especially in their marriage, because purity culture is very based in patriarchy. So it sets up this hierarchy, including in the sexual relationship. And that can lead to a host of problems like abusive marriages or just unhealthy ones. Can increase the risk of divorce if people are in that unhealthy or unhappy marriage. And just your relationship to yourself too, like to our body image, it can affect that, leading to greater body shame, and to our mental health too. And like I said, there's less empirical research on that topic, but it certainly can cause a lot of anxiety when you're constantly in your head about sexuality or about your body or about, the effects of whatever clothing I choose has on men that day and things like that. Like those are some of the things I hear from clients. And those effects stick around for a long time. I think that's what's most surprising to some of my clients is they'll say, it's been 20 years, 30 years since I've heard these teachings, since I sat in youth groups, since I got married even. Why am I still struggling? Or why is my body still responding this way to my spouse when we are in a healthy and a loving marriage? So that's very confusing for people, and also brings a lot of shame because they're like, what's wrong with me that I'm responding this way to my husband?
Yeah, boy, I couldn't say amen more to everything you just said. I see all those same things with all the people I work with. I have definitely talked about a lot of these teachings and how we talk about sex to our youth in particular and our emerging adults very much through a fear-based kind of consequence-based perspective versus a fear-based perspective or a relational-based perspective. And I've called it spiritual sexual abuse, right?
Yeah.
So I do think it has that type. I think it's really important to repeat what you said, that people who have the effects of sexual trauma from physical sexual abuse are having similar symptoms to people who are coming out of purity culture. I just think that theme's repeating, and that's really tragic in a lot of ways, especially when what I see, even still, a lot of these things, of course, are still being taught. It's not like these things have finished being taught, is that some of the people that are most affected by this are the people who took religion most seriously, right? And who are trying their best to be really righteous and really good and really, be on the good side of the Lord, right? Or of God, or whatever language they use for their deity. So they're really kind of, high values types folks, really, tender kind of in some of their spirituality and their personalities even. And it's just tragic to watch, right in front of us, so many people still being affected by this.
Yeah, I say those of us who committed to it the hardest deconstruct the hardest, because it's interesting when I meet people and they, ask what my book is about, and I have to, try to explain it in a nutshell. And some people are like, oh yeah, I think I heard that at school. Didn't stick with me, and it's just very nonchalant for them. And I think that is kind of mind-blowing for me and some of my clients who are so deeply affected by this, because it wasn't just a one-time, sermon we heard or a lesson at school or something our parents told us. It was really deeply ingrained and something maybe we deeply held to and have experienced years and years of shame over. So, it can affect some people for a really long time.
Well, and that's what happens with trauma, right? I mean, once you have trauma in your body, it's not typically something that completely goes away. Just like I usually make the metaphor of my ACL and my knee. I've done a lot of physical therapy on it. I can still ski, yet it still hurts at times, and I still have to be careful at times. And when I ski past the place where it happened, I still have a little thing of what happened 25 years ago, 30 years ago. So that's how trauma works, and why it's so important to, first of all, name it, acknowledge it, and then get treatment for it, right? All right, well, let's move on to, you have a whole segment in the book called The 5 Myths. I thought these were super spot on. Spend a little bit of time on each one explaining what they are.
Okay. Yeah. So section 2 is deconstructing the myths. The first myth is the spiritual barometer myth, the idea that our spirituality and spiritual maturity are measured by virginity. And that's what I'm was referencing earlier when I said like my whole faith became very reduced to just this narrow definition of purity. Purity was equated with virginity instead of kind of a broader concept or virtue of chastity or purity of heart, things like that. And so it led to a lot of like pride in my case when I did kind of follow the tenets of purity culture and didn't get that promised reward, judgmentalism. And then I think for those who don't, follow purity culture, it can lead to a lot of shame. So my understanding is that this myth is similar in your faith background too, and especially for women. Like in my faith tradition, there's less expectation for men to uphold it than there is for women. There's a little bit of a double standard, or a little bit of like, well, boys will be boys, or he couldn't help himself kind of thing. It's much more emphasized for women. Do you want me to move on to the second, or do you want to respond?
No, let's stick with each one for a little bit.
Okay.
Because I think, this is a huge one. I totally agree with you that we use these terms like chastity, purity, virtue, clean, pure, right? All those terms, and nobody's thinking about other things like, oh, does this person not cheat on their ACTs, or does this person, have like, are they kind to their neighbors? We're all thinking about sex and sexuality. Sex and sexuality are basically defined as intercourse, and it's also very heteronormatively talked about. And so, a lot of a person's value of themselves and self-identity are tied to what has happened to their body.
Yeah.
I was not one that kept that promise. So I was one that had premarital sex. And even though I felt very guilty about it and very ashamed about it, so because it wasn't congruent with my values and beliefs at the time, and it really did a number on my self-identity, right? Like I really thought about, that damaged goods kind of narrative that so many people talked about. I definitely felt that way. And it impacted my marriage, because when I came into and not just my marriage, my whole dating experience, right? So it just, every young man I would date, I was always like, do I tell them? Do I not tell them? I had been told through my repentance process not to tell necessarily potential spouses, because once you repent, it's over. But then that kind of kept this secrecy with people that I was potentially going to spend the rest of my life with. And then when my ex-husband now, when he found out about this, it really caused, I would say, like almost like a 4 to 5 year rift between us, even though we were married, because it was just difficult for him to process the way he had been taught, right? And the way he, like you talked about, sometimes we think we're entitled to certain blessings or promises if we keep our virginity, and he had, and so he had expected to. What was the promise? He would meet a wonderful, beautiful, righteous, virtuous woman to marry. And then here I come, miss damaged goods. So it's just really interesting to look back on that time and how I was, kind of hustling for my worth and trying to convince myself and convince others that I was still worth being a partner to. That does a number, and then of course that showed up in how I showed up sexually, because I was like, well, I don't want to do anything that would make my husband think that I know how to do this, or that would remind him that I know how to do this, or that I've learned some of this somewhere else. And so it really hampered my ability just to explore and be playful and have fun with my husband. Right. So,
yeah. And just that concept of, I want to marry a good girl, like gets again narrowly reduced to just a virgin, as if that's the only thing that makes someone a good girl. And everything else that you have to offer, everything else that you bring to the relationship, all the other wonderful traits that you have get ignored, and just the shame attached to sexual history.
Yeah, exactly. And I've also heard a lot of people tell me, you mentioned pride, like you took pride and maybe got judgmental of others. But I've also seen a lot of women in particular that even if they stayed virginous until they got married, once they had sex after marriage, it's almost like a part of their identity went away, and they felt dirty even though they were now married, like, because sex had been so like matched with this idea of like things you're not supposed to do. That was and I think you talk about one of these myths, I think, is the switch, right? But I think this has to do also with this idea of like, I've lost a part of my purity, even though I'm married. So
Absolutely. Yeah. And I especially see that in my younger clients, that got married really young and newly married, and they're just wrestling with like, am I still pure? And this, like you said, this part of my identity, this part of my value is gone. And so we talk about like, what are your values about sex and marriage? Because that message of sex is bad, sex is wrong, avoid it is so strong. Like, what is the message for marriage? And are you adhering to your values of sex within your marriage? And if so, then it's still pure. It's still pure sex. And so we'll put that in whatever language that they are comfortable using. But yeah, it becomes a huge part of your just virtue, value, and identity when it's like literally a ring that you wore on your hand up until you exchanged it for your wedding ring. Then that's a tough switch to make.
yeah. Yeah. Okay. Let's move on to myth number 2.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Number 2 is the fairy tale myth.
Yeah.
And this is the one that affected me the most, just that belief that if I followed the rules, I'll get my fairy tale marriage. And this was really promised to me that it was going to come at a young age. It was probably going to be my first love. I was never going to get my heart broken because I didn't give myself away. And just a lot of emphasis on marriage for women, especially, like being a good partner and a suitable mate and praying for your future husband. And I just didn't hear those same kind of encouragement given to young men. They were more encouraged to focus on their education and their friendships and their hobbies and, get a good job to make money one day, things like that, rather than being a good partner and things like that. So this one led to some entitlement, but then a lot of disillusionment when that fairy tale didn't come about in the way that I thought it was going to. I got my heart broken when my first relationship ended in college. The person that I thought I was going to marry, that was the one at the time. And it was just like, why did I follow the rules if this is what I'm going to get? It was a lot of pain in that breakup and in that season of my life. And so I think this can even show up for people who get married and their marriage just isn't what they expected. It's a lot harder than they expected. Or I interviewed some women for the book who were divorced because I wanted to incorporate some of that perspective. A lot of them got married at 20 and were divorced by 25, and they all kind of said some version of like, well, I was taught just to look for a Christian. Like, as long as we loved God, then things were going to work out. And as long as we saved ourselves, we were going to be blessed. And that wasn't enough. We were told that was enough, but frankly, it wasn't, And
Right.
so they were affected too, even the ones who did find who they thought was the one at a young age.
Yeah, I totally agree with this. I see this a lot too. I think a lot of people feel betrayed, not just by the culture, but even by God. So I think it affects their ability to feel close to God or to feel like, the blessings, I guess, that they were promised are not coming. And that's very confusing. And I think a lot of times I talk about this, like we are taught that healthy sex equals marital sex.
Mm-hmm.
But that's all we're taught, right?
Mm-hmm.
You just get married and then you have healthy sex or good sex, but nobody's teaching you how to have good sex or how to have healthy sex or teaching you any principles about sex. So I even have lots of couples that show up that actually have a really good marriage. It's going well and they love each other and they're parenting well and overall things are pretty good and they're not having a good sex life. And they're very confused about this, right? Like, why? I thought sex was going to be super beautiful, wonderful, all the things, right, that get promised. And especially if you have like painful sex, or, I talk about honeymoon trauma a lot, right? Because if you have two inexperienced people who are coming together and all of a sudden, and they haven't oftentimes done a whole lot of things prior to that honeymoon because they're trying to, again, stay pure. And then all of a sudden they're naked together, but have very little experience of what to do with two naked bodies. And they're like, okay, it's almost performative. Like we have to just do the act instead of understanding the arousal and the getting warmed up and all the importance of foreplay and all those things. It just kind of can start this very sad, kind of narrative and history. Like a lot of these folks don't come in for 10, 15, even 20 years later for the first time saying, hey, we've had problems since our honeymoon. So that can be really, there's no fairy tale about that.
Yeah, and that makes me sad what you said, like a couple that loves each other and has a healthy marriage, but they're just not connecting sexually. But to me, that shows the importance of sex education and getting some coaching on sexual techniques and just educating themselves, because they can have that with the healthy marriage and with the help and support that they need. But it's not an automatic thing, and that leads us to the next myth of the flipped switch myth, that as soon as you get married, you just flip a switch and sex is going to be instantly amazing. And as we're saying, that's not the case, especially if you're young and inexperienced, didn't get any sex education, and haven't really explored your sexuality in any way before getting married. It's going to take a while to develop that skill, to learn that skill, and to practice it with each other, and to feel comfortable and uninhibited, and things like that, especially because sex was so shameful. So when I work with couples with sexual pain or that are young and inexperienced, we focus a lot on just basic sex education.
Yeah. Yep. I would agree with that. Yeah, the flip the switch is something I hear a lot of. It's like the no, 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 but then you're expected to go, go, go.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
And it's not as easy as that, because again, you've been holding yourself kind of, especially I think if you're in a female body, you've been holding yourself almost like defensively,
Yeah.
We're taught a lot of gendered messages about men versus women, and men are kind of all they care about is getting in your pants, and all that's all they want is sex. So even when you marry somebody, I kind of talk about it like sleeping with the enemy. You've been taught that male, if you're in a heterosexual relationship, that this male is going to kind of come to get you. And I hear this a lot, even in married folks, that I feel objectified by my own partner, or I feel like that's all they want from me, and obviously there can be some issues around that because of how men have been socialized to get emotional needs met, which is often sex, right? And so that can be an issue, but oftentimes it's just, I'm still not comfortable being desired, being wanted, being deemed sexy or sexual, because I was taught to cover up. We'll talk about the modesty rhetoric a little bit later, but really hard to switch that.
Yeah, and it can lead to a sense of obligation, especially for women too. Like, oh, if he's turned on or if he sees my body, like that's going to obligate me to have sex. And then it becomes drudgery and duty instead of something that's beautiful and enjoyable and pleasurable for both of them, with a focus on like both of their experiences. So that obligation sex message is a libido killer for many women.
Yeah, Dr. Cami Hirsch just did some excellent research on that. And similar to what you're saying about trauma, it duty and obligatory sex, even when it's not coerced, even though the husband isn't necessarily doing anything to, guilt somebody into that. And oftentimes it's unaware that the wife is showing up in that kind of duty obligatory way, but that definitely can lead to PTSD symptoms in that woman's body. I often say your body doesn't know you're married. Your body, you're Christian. Your body doesn't know you're Mormon. All your body knows is, am I in a pleasurable, safe space, or am I in a space I don't really want to be in, right? That's what your body knows. And so if you're forcing your body to be in a space it doesn't really resonate with, that, even though, again, the intention can be good. I want to meet my husband where he's at. I want to be a good wife. I want to meet their needs. Your body could care less about all of that.
Yeah, and that's why a lot of my book is focused on integrating the mind and body, getting them on the same page, because as I was doing coaching for purity culture recovery, a lot of my clients had already read some books or had already been following me, had already, done some work enough to know that these were myths and to know what the truth was. And so they had kind of changed their mind, but their body had not caught up with it. Their body was still stuck in, well, sex is for my husband, not for me. So it's just a duty. I just have to do this for him. It's a need I have to meet. Or sex is shameful and dirty and wrong. So thinking about it, even if I'm just thinking about my husband, is wrong. So they've switched their mind, but not their body. And so a lot of the work is getting those all aligned and on the same page, so that your mind and body and heart and soul, like, all are present in your sexuality, in a values congruent way. So that was something that I really learned, and that's kind of surprised me when I first started doing this work of, like, it's not enough to just change our beliefs, because they're really embedded in our nervous system, in our bodies.
Exactly. That's exactly right. I speak with my clients about that all the time too. It's that's usually the first place things change is intellectually. And then you've got to let it percolate, right? It's got to
Right.
percolate down. You've got to practice things. You've
Yes.
got to put your body into spaces where you're practicing new behavior, new ideas. And at first, that's going to be really uncomfortable.
Yeah, yeah, and can be really scary to do something different, put yourself in those new experiences, to try out the new beliefs. That really is what makes the change. Once you have some safety in your body and with yourself, being able to experience that safety outside of yourself too.
Yeah. Yep. Exactly. All right. I think we're to the fifth myth. Are we?
Well, the fourth one, we were already kind of dancing around, I guess, which is the gatekeepers myth, that women are the gatekeepers of sexuality. And you were saying like modesty is a big part of this, constantly being hypervigilant for men who are looking at me or who are being turned on by me, or for signs that your husband wants sex, things like that. Like constantly feeling like the woman has to put on the boundaries before marriage, but then always be sexually available after marriage. That's a lot of pressure. And that hurts both partners too. Sometimes people will ask, like, is this book for men too? And I'll say, it's for anyone, especially men who are in a married heterosexual relationship. I think it can really help them to understand their wives and understand how they relate to each other, because there can be a lot of entitlement for men baked into purity culture, that you're entitled to sex, that you once you're married, you just had to rein in your sex drive beforehand, but once you're married you can unleash it on your wife, and she's going to be constantly there to meet your needs, calling sex a need even, which I would argue that it's not. And also what you said about getting their emotional needs met through sex. Like I will tell my clients, sex is not a need, but connection is, attachment and safe relationships, that is a need. But you can get that met in other ways besides sex, that they've been socialized to only see like physical touch and sex as ways to get that closeness need met.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a whole nother thing that I probably won't even open up Pandora's box on that one, about whether it's a need or a drive. Or, I mean, obviously it's a very strong pull for many people. Not everybody has a high libido or a high drive. And of course, a lot of these things that we've been talking about can actually lower drive for folks, and putting anybody in a space where if they have low drive and now they're expected to act sexually is part of what we've been talking about, sexual trauma. At the same time, it's a very strong sense of whatever we want to call it. It's a strong, maybe I'd call it a drive. Obviously, we don't need sex to survive. Everybody, we need food, we need water. And at the same time, I think it's definitely a part of people's wellness. And I guess what I'm saying is that I agree with you. And it's always a yes and for me. Like, yes, it's not, you're not entitled to sex. Just because you're married doesn't mean you're going to get sex. It doesn't. And at the same time, if folks realize that sexuality is such an important part of their lives, and it's not for their partner, I always legitimize that it could be a deal breaker for the two of you, and that's okay too, right? Sometimes we just don't match in certain ways that are very difficult for us to continue to live an entire life. Because my other concern is that we have the entitlement issue that's bad, but we also have the celibacy entitlement issue, which I think is equally as bad, right? Where one partner, especially in monogamy, where one partner gets to decide what the sex is going to look like, and either way, it's not healthy, right? So I just try to like yes and that a little bit. But yeah, the gatekeeper one is huge, and again, when you think about the role that is, it's not a pleasurable role; it's a monitoring role.
Yes, it's one that takes you out of your body and keeps you in your head. So you're constantly self-monitoring or monitoring the sexual encounter, which is going to get in the way of pleasure, because that requires you to be in your body and in your sensations and to notice feelings of arousal and allow those to grow. Yeah. So when I work with clients who've been, married and sexually active for over a decade and they've never had an orgasm, or, some that have couple decades, it's often because of that, or that's at least a contributor. That self-monitoring and performance anxiety and spectatoring is what it's often called, where you're kind of watching yourself perform in the sexual encounter instead of being fully inhabiting your body.
Yeah, right. Yep, for sure. Okay. Myth number 5.
Yes, the last one is the damaged goods myth. And so we talked about that earlier because it's the opposite kind of to the spiritual barometer myth. I think this is the most damaging one because it just leads to such inherent shame for people who do have premarital sex, for people who are sexually abused, no choice of their own, no fault of their own. And even for people who wait, like there's still so much body shame. There's still shame about their sexuality and what that represents. Yeah, so it just leads to a lot of shame for all of us.
Yeah, that somehow something sexual happens to your body, you are now shifted in your value, like you said with that first myth. But yeah, and that's really egregious, right? To be thinking about yourself only through that lens. You mentioned in the book, you know, a few parts more related to men. Like I think I agree, even in our culture, even though I think both men and women are held to a very high standard to stay pure in Mormonism, we're not talked to about sex in the same way. So we are held to the same standard. But boys and young men are usually talked to a lot more about masturbation and pornography than girls are. Like we're assuming girls are not looking at pornography or not touching their own bodies, which is also a weird thing that we assume. And then boys are definitely held to that. So I think a lot of men feel the damaged goods narrative, not so much by having sex, but by being called pornography addicts, sex addicts from a very young age, even though their behavior, and you mentioned the research in your book that the behavior is not really any more frequent than mainstream culture. In fact, even less frequent, but a lot of people will identify as those kind of sex or porn addicts types of identities.
Because of the stigma, yeah, and because it's not really acceptable in the religions, and so it becomes like a taboo behavior. But labels like sex addict or porn addict or something like that just heap on more shame. You know, they're not helpful. If someone is using pornography or doing something that's not congruent with their values, I always want to help them change that if that's their goal. But I don't think the label is helpful or the shame that's attached to it is helpful.
Yeah. Yep. No, I agree. All right. So you also talk about cultures. So you talk about myths, but then you talk about cultures, and I think they coincide. So maybe we can spend a little bit of time on that. And then I'm going to save a little bit of time for you to maybe give a few nuggets of advice, but I'm going to basically tell people go get the book for the nuggets of advice.
Yeah, because we've had a long conversation already.
Yeah, right. And you have a lot of really good exercises. You know, when you talked about mind versus body, one of the tools that you offer in this book is a lot of like journaling prompts, kind of questionnaires, things that help that kind of body stuff, get more attuned with your brain. So I'm going to leave that to that. But let's talk about modesty culture, rape culture, courtship culture, marriage culture, purity culture. So those are things that you talked about.
Yes, I call those 5 toxic Christian cultures because they are born out of, church and Christian cultures, but they're not, I would argue, they're not biblical or consistent with godly values. So modesty culture is really connected to that gatekeeper's myth that women have to watch what they wear so that they don't cause men to stumble, they don't tempt men. And this leads into rape culture, because if you do wear certain clothes and then you're sexually assaulted or abused, then sometimes the blame is on the woman, the victim, because of what you wore, because he can't help himself, he's a man, or you were leading him on with what you wore or what you were doing. So those are very toxic, shame-based, and again can affect women for so long, even into their adulthood and into their marriage, still feeling a lot of inhibitions and shyness with their bodies, or being uncomfortable wearing certain things out in public or in private. Courtship culture is that I kiss dating goodbye method of dating, where you pretty much avoid dating and allow your parents to sort of arrange a courtship where you get to know the other person and then get married. The Duggar family kind of epitomizes this process, and they've done it with many of their kids. This was held up as kind of the standard when it's really not biblically based. Of course, we don't have a biblical basis for our modern dating era. Like it's just not going to be reflected in the Bible or in our faith tradition. So Yeah, so that one makes people afraid to date. I have a lot of clients who are single in their, 30s who are like, I've never dated. They've never been on a date, never kissed someone, just like don't know how to even date, or there's this awkwardness or even fear of the opposite sex because of those messages. And then marriage culture is the idolization of marriage. I say that there's nothing inherently wrong with marriage. I'm married and I love being married, but the idolization of it, that it becomes this idol in the church that's held up as this is the epitome of adulthood or of spiritual maturity. This is how you fit into the body because there's really not a place for single people, especially once you get to a certain age. There's more leadership opportunities if you're married, things like that. And then I say that purity culture has elements of all of those cultures because they all are rooted in patriarchy. Like that's the common foundation for all of the toxic Christian cultures.
Yeah, right. And one thing that you said that I just want to quote one thing here, which is, I really loved this quote, is that the problem is we cannot simultaneously heal from purity culture and promote patriarchy. I'm going to say that again. The problem is we cannot simultaneously heal from purity culture and promote patriarchy. We cannot support a culture that subordinates women to men. We cannot subscribe to a belief system that puts men in charge of women's sexuality, yet blames and holds women responsible for men's sexual sin. That's a really profound comment. And I think, especially with bro culture these days and a lot of things that's happening politically and things of that nature, sometimes people get confused that patriarchy is like this war against men. And I think you make it clear in the book, and I always talk about this, that patriarchy is a system that hurts us all. Because anytime you have one group kind of in charge or with power over another group, that hurts both groups. And so this is what we're talking about with undoing patriarchy is getting more into egalitarian models of marriage, of relationships, of sexuality, and holding all parties, responsible for both pleasure and pain.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've talked with Dr. Julie Hanks, who's a LDS therapist and influencer, and she calls it an equal partnership marriage, I believe. And egalitarian is the term that I use because it's moving away from these views of we're so different and we have different roles that are God ordained, and he's the head and the leader, and the woman is submissive, and it gets into more equality, like we're equal in value and role. We both like serve and worship alongside each other and journey through life together as equals and partners in our marriage or in our sexual relationship. It's a mutual partnership and not a hierarchy.
Yes. Right. Okay. So a lot of if you want to talk, you already mentioned that a lot of this work is about integrating the body and the mind. Do you want to say anything just really quickly as far as just if you had to give, an elevator 3-minute, 3 sentences type of thing about how do we recover from purity culture? What would you say? Because then I want to talk about your sexual ethics as well.
Okay. How you recover, I think, is getting the mind, body, heart, and soul aligned. And a first step that I recommend when people ask me this question is to begin a practice of mindfulness meditation. It can be as simple as just downloading a free mindfulness app or YouTubing a mindfulness video, and just learning how to notice and observe your thoughts, feelings, and body sensations without necessarily acting on them or trying to change them or fix them, without suppressing them or without dwelling on them. That's really what mindfulness is just the awareness and the presence with non-judgment, not judging your experience or your emotions or sensations. That is the foundation for a lot of the therapy work that I do and the coaching work that I do for purity culture, because it gets us started noticing what our beliefs are, how they're affecting us, and then we can do something about it once we start noticing it. So that is a good first step and foundation for people who are interested in taking this journey.
Yeah, no, I think that is a great, mindfulness is such a powerful tool that can be used for so many things, and definitely for this. So I would totally agree with you on that. You've talked a lot today about your own deconstruction. In our community, especially post-Mormon community, usually what that means is people have left the church, left their belief system behind. And I believe a lot of people still continue to be Christian or deists. However, in my post-Mormon kind of anecdotal experience, many people move towards agnostic beliefs or even atheist beliefs. That's not your story, right? Your story is I have deconstructed these harmful beliefs, and I have very much stayed Christian, and I've very much stayed part of, I believe, a faith community of some sort. I'm sure you're a churchgoer of some sort. And even your beliefs about premarital sex and hoping that, your own children will wait until they're married to have sex is very much still part of that belief system of how you conceptualize. I think you call it biblical sex, whatever languages you use. So that's an interesting thing for people who want to stay involved in their church communities. Mm-hmm. And I do think that there are a lot of LDS and Mormon folks who want to remain Mormon, want to stay part of their faith community, and yet don't want to propagate purity culture, and are confused as to, well, what do I teach my kids? How do I talk about these things? How do I espouse my values and my hopes, even that maybe that people would wait until they were in a long-term or committed relationship or even a marital relationship without harming, traumatizing, shaming, in the process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I give a lot of tips, scripts that can be tailored in the parenting chapter of my book, suggestions and resources there. But I try to leave a lot of space in the book for people to arrive at different conclusions than me, a lot of space and respect while being honest about where I've landed. My goal, goal overarching for people is to be able to come to a values congruent sexual ethic, and their values may be different than mine, and I respect and recognize that. But I think when you're talking about parents, we want more for our kids than just hookup culture, than just casual sex. I think most parents want their kids to value the power that sex holds, the beauty it can hold, the ways that it can profoundly affect us, and to make wise and discerning choices about that. So I talk a lot about arriving at your deeper why for your sexual ethic. And the process of that for me was, my deeper why is no longer based in these myths of purity culture of staying sexually abstinent so you get that fairy tale marriage. That was my original why, but based deeper in my theology and in my relationship with God. And for other people, it's going to look different. It might be based in a value of treating others with respect and kindness and caring for them. It might be based on different values. And so I just want to challenge people and kind of encourage them to go on that process of exploring what their values are, and then checking to see if their ethic is congruent with that, and if their behavior then reflects that. And so I think that's something that we can impart to our kids, is helping them critically think about what their values are and arriving at their deeper why for their sexual ethics.
Yeah, that's lovely. And I really appreciated how you did. I do believe you were very careful and tried to leave a lot of room for different ideas and values. Is there anything I'm not asking as we're ending the end here that you would like to talk about, that you're like, oh shoot, she didn't ask me about this or that?
No, I think there's so many different topics we can go on. But yeah, anything else that you think would be helpful for your audience or that they would want to know?
Well, I think you did an excellent job. She's the author of Recovering from Purity Culture, right?
Yeah.
I guess I would leave with two thoughts. One is, I think everybody could benefit from reading this book. Again, whether you're male, female, whether you're gay or straight, it is, a bit heteronormative, and at the same time, people who are in gay and lesbian relationships and bisexual relationships are still very much affected by so many of these messages. And I've talked to many of my lesbian couples about how just because I'm married to a woman doesn't mean that these myths are not still affecting me, my sex life with my partner. I think anybody can benefit from it. I do think that, especially if you're post-religious in the Mormon community, there may be some parts of this book that maybe you wouldn't agree with, or that, you would find even triggering in some ways. And I'm a big believer of reading things that we don't always completely agree with, because that helps us with our differentiation skills. And I think that that's a healthy practice, especially because you have it really well researched. I think that the parts that they might bristle at a little bit is just your own personal values or your own beliefs. And I think that's good for us to practice that. And so I think all those who are still either in church or wanting to find new church, or have spirituality as a big part of their, belief system, and are wanting to again, find ways to have better language, better ways of talking about sexual values, especially if you're a parent. I think this offers a lot of really great language in that regard as well. So,
well, thank you, Natasha. I appreciate you saying
for your work.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that a lot. And I believe in reading things you disagree with too. I had to read a lot of diverse books as research for this of, how do I want to differentiate from those other purity culture offerings and offer something different. And so I think it is a good practice, but I also respect that some people might not be in the place where they can do that if they're in their own trauma recovery. And so that's understandable too. And I've had people say on Facebook, like, this is not going to be a good resource for me and where I'm at. And I'm like, good for you for knowing that about yourself and making that choice.
Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you so much for your time and your willingness to be with my audience today. I really appreciate that. And I wish you the best in all your endeavors.
Thank you. You too.
All right. Take care.
Thank you for listening to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional Facebook page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. You can also find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The information shared on this program is informational and should not be considered therapy. This podcast addresses many topics around mental health and sexuality and may not be suitable for minors. Some topics may elicit a trigger or emotional response, so please care for yourself accordingly. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed by our guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views or feelings of Natasha Helfer or the Natasha Helfer Podcast. We provide a platform for open and diverse discussions, and it is important to recognize that different perspectives may be shared. We encourage our listeners to engage in critical thinking and form their own opinions. The intro and outro music for these episodes is by Otter Creek. Thank you for listening.
There is a place where time slows to nature's pace, and there is space there to find yourself in her embrace. Some places should be left alone. Na tishki say the namo, so we can always go to the homeland of the heart. Years of our human history etched on her canyon walls, alongside Earth's mysteries. Some places should be left alone. Nahotishki shade the Namu, so we can to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart. In our cities, we sleep without her stars, yet still her presence sustains us from afar. Some places should be left alone. Nahotishki shade the Nabu, so we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart.